There's a specific moment in an empath's life that almost nobody sees coming, not even the empath themselves most of the time. A moment where something that felt permanent, unshakable, endlessly renewable, simply stops. Not gradually, not with warning signs anyone could have easily read in advance. It arrives, seemingly overnight, as a complete shift in how an empath relates to the people, the demands, and the emotional labor that used to define their entire way of moving through the world. Today, we're talking about that moment, the breaking point, what actually causes it, what it looks like from the inside and the outside, and why it changes an empath more permanently than almost any other experience they'll ever have. Let's start with a distinction that matters enormously, because without it, this entire topic gets misunderstood constantly. A breaking point is not the same thing as a breakdown. A breakdown is often loud, visible, temporary. A crisis that, once it passes, tends to return the person to something close to their previous baseline. A breaking point is quieter and far more permanent. It's not a collapse. It's a threshold being crossed, after which the person on the other side simply doesn't operate the same way they did before, in a manner that rarely reverses itself, even once the acute crisis that triggered it has long since passed. To understand why empaths, specifically, experience this particular kind of threshold so distinctly, you have to understand what's actually been happening internally for years, often decades, before the breaking point ever arrives. An empath's entire relational strategy from very early in life usually involves an enormous amount of invisible labor, constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of every room they enter, absorbing other people's distress as though it were their own responsibility to manage, extending patience and understanding far past the point most people would consider reasonable, and doing all of this largely without ever naming the cost out loud, because naming it has always felt to them like an imposition on everyone else's comfort. This invisible labor accumulates. Every unspoken resentment, every need quietly set aside in favor of someone else's, every moment of over-explaining, over-giving, overextending, none of it actually disappears once the moment passes. It gets stored somewhere below conscious awareness, building what amounts to an enormous, invisible debt that nobody around the empath ever sees accruing, because the empath themselves has usually gotten remarkably skilled at making sure nobody has to. This is exactly why the breaking point, when it finally arrives, so often looks disproportionate to whatever specific incident seems to have triggered it. Someone forgets a small commitment, says something mildly thoughtless, makes one more request that would have been completely reasonable in isolation, and the empath's reaction seems to everyone watching wildly out of proportion to what actually just happened. But it isn't disproportionate at all once you understand what's actually happening underneath. That final, seemingly minor incident isn't the cause of the breaking point. It's simply the last addition to a debt that had already, quietly, been building for years, finally tipping the scale past what the system can continue to absorb. Let's talk about what actually happens physiologically and psychologically in the moments and days immediately following this threshold being crossed, because it's genuinely distinct from ordinary frustration or ordinary anger, and understanding the difference explains a huge amount of what people witness when an empath reaches this point. The first thing that happens is a sudden, almost disorienting drop in the compulsion to explain or justify. For years, an empath's default response to conflict has usually involved intense effort toward being understood, explaining feelings clearly, providing context, searching for language that might finally make someone else see their perspective. At the breaking point, this compulsion often simply vanishes, seemingly overnight. The empath stops trying to make anyone understand anything, not because they've given up on communication in some despairing way, but because the internal need for that specific person's understanding has genuinely, structurally dissolved. This absence is often the first sign, to people around the empath, that something has shifted permanently, because it looks so unlike the version of them everyone had grown used to. The second thing that happens is an almost clinical clarity about the actual pattern of the relationship or situation that led here. Before the breaking point, an empath's view of a difficult relationship is often clouded by ongoing hope, ongoing charitable interpretation, ongoing willingness to explain away individual incidents, as isolated rather than part of a larger pattern. After the breaking point, that clouding lifts, often quite suddenly, and the empath can usually describe, with startling accuracy and surprising emotional distance, the entire arc of what's actually been happening, not as a series of separate, unfortunate incidents, but as one continuous, coherent pattern that had simply never been named out loud before. The third thing that happens, and this one confuses people close to the empath more than almost anything else, a marked decrease in emotional reactivity, even in situations that would previously have provoked visible distress. This can look, from the outside, like coldness setting in, like the empath has simply stopped caring. But what's actually happening is closer to an internal recalibration of what's worth reacting to at all. The threshold being crossed often involves the nervous system essentially concluding that continued high-alert investment in this particular relationship or situation is no longer serving any purpose. And that conclusion produces a kind of protective flatness that looks superficially like indifference, but is actually closer to exhaustion finally being honored rather than overridden. The fourth thing that happens, and it's one of the more painful realizations for people who witness an empath reach this point without understanding what it means. A sudden unwillingness to extend the benefit of the doubt that used to be automatic. Before the breaking point, an empath's default interpretation of ambiguous behavior tends toward the most charitable possible explanation. They were probably just having a hard day. They probably didn't mean it the way it sounded. Surely there's context I'm missing that would make this make sense. After the breaking point, this default flips, often permanently. Ambiguous behavior starts getting interpreted through the lens of the pattern that's already been established, rather than through hopeful charitable assumption, because the charitable assumption has already been tested repeatedly and found, again and again, not to hold up against the accumulated evidence. I want to be honest about something important here, because this entire topic can easily slide into something that sounds purely negative, purely about loss or ending, when actually, the breaking point serves an enormously important function that deserves to be named clearly. It's the mechanism by which an empath finally, after years of overextension, begins protecting a resource that was never actually infinite in the first place. Without this threshold, without this capacity to eventually, finally, stop absorbing more than a person can sustainably carry, empaths would simply be ground down indefinitely by relationships and situations that took without ever giving back proportionally. The breaking point, however disorienting it feels in the moment it arrives, is actually one of the healthiest mechanisms an empath's psychology has ever developed. A built-in circuit breaker, protecting against a kind of depletion that has no natural floor otherwise. This reframe matters enormously, because so many empaths, in the immediate aftermath of reaching this point, experience intense guilt about the shift, worried that the sudden clarity, the reduced reactivity, the withdrawn benefit of the doubt means they've become cold or unkind, or somehow morally worse than the endlessly patient version of themselves that came before. This guilt is almost always misplaced. The breaking point isn't evidence of moral decline, it's evidence of a system that finally, correctly, recognized it had been operating past its sustainable capacity for far too long and adjusted accordingly, the same way any overloaded structure eventually has to shed weight in order to keep standing at all. And here's where things get genuinely interesting, because the breaking point isn't actually the end of this story, it's the beginning of a completely different chapter that almost nobody discusses in typical content about empaths, which tends to focus entirely on the depletion itself, rather than what actually happens afterward. Because once this threshold has been crossed, once the old patterns of over-giving, over-explaining, and endless benefit of the doubt have genuinely dissolved, rather than simply been suppressed through willpower, something begins to build in their place. A new relational architecture that operates completely differently from anything that existed before. One that tends to be far more sustainable, far more selective, and counterintuitively, far more capable of genuine, lasting closeness than the exhausting, boundless generosity that came before it ever could have produced. And that's exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What actually gets built on the other side of an empath's breaking point, why the people who witness this transformation often describe someone who seems, paradoxically, both harder to reach and easier to trust than they ever were before, and why this threshold, once crossed, becomes one of the most important turning points in an empath's entire life. Not because of what it took away, but because of what it finally permanently made room for. Let's talk about what actually gets built on the other side of this threshold, because this is the part almost nobody explains clearly, and it's the part that transforms the breaking point from something that sounds purely like loss into something that's actually the foundation of a completely different and often much healthier way of relating to other people. The first thing that gets built slowly over the weeks and months following the breaking point is what I'd call conditional generosity, a version of giving that used to be automatic, unconditional, and available regardless of how it was received, but that now requires an actual assessment of whether the relationship in question is genuinely reciprocal before that same depth of care gets extended again. This isn't coldness, even though it can feel that way at first to the empath themselves, who's used to giving as a reflex rather than a choice. It's the introduction of discernment into a system that previously operated without any filter at all. And this shift, uncomfortable as it initially feels, tends to produce relationships that are dramatically more stable and more genuinely mutual than anything the boundless, unconditional version of generosity ever managed to sustain. The second thing that gets built is a genuinely new relationship with disappointing people. Before the breaking point, disappointing someone else felt, to most empaths, like a kind of low-grade emergency, something to be avoided at almost any cost, even the cost of their own well-being. After the breaking point, something shifts in how that discomfort gets processed. The empath still feels the pull of not wanting to disappoint someone, because that instinct doesn't simply vanish overnight. But they develop, often for the first time in their life, the capacity to tolerate that discomfort without immediately overriding their own limits to avoid it. This is one of the quieter, less dramatic changes that happens on the other side of the threshold, but it's also one of the most important, because it's the foundation of every healthy boundary that gets built afterward. The third thing that gets built, and this one surprises people the most, a genuinely improved capacity for actual intimacy rather than the performance of endless availability that so often gets mistaken for intimacy in the empath's earlier relationships. This sounds counterintuitive because the breaking point looks, from the outside, like someone becoming harder to reach, more guarded, less immediately available than they used to be. But real intimacy was never actually built on unconditional availability. It was built on honesty, on the capacity to say no, on the willingness to disappoint someone occasionally in service of telling the truth about your own actual limits and needs. An empath who has crossed this threshold often becomes, paradoxically, a far better partner and friend than the version of themselves that existed before, not because they care less, but because what they do offer now is honest, sustainable, and actually reflective of what they're genuinely willing and able to give, rather than an exhausting performance of boundless generosity that was always quietly running on fumes underneath. The fourth thing that gets built, and this is the one that ties everything else together, an internal locus of worth that no longer depends on being endlessly useful, endlessly available, or endlessly accommodating in order to feel valuable at all. This is, in many ways, the deepest and most important shift the breaking point ever produces, because it addresses the actual root of why the overgiving pattern existed in the first place. Somewhere, usually very early in life, most empaths learned that their worth was tied to what they could provide for others rather than simply who they were. The breaking point, disorienting and painful as it is in the moment, often becomes the first real opportunity to build something different, a sense of value that exists independent of usefulness, independent of being needed, independent of constant emotional labor performed on behalf of everyone else's comfort. I want to say something honest here about the people who witness an empath cross this threshold, because their experience of it matters too, and deserves to be addressed directly rather than skipped past. For people who benefited from the old pattern, who got used to unconditional access, endless patience, automatic forgiveness, the breaking point often feels, initially, like a genuine loss, and sometimes even like a personal attack, even when it isn't one. It's worth naming clearly. The empath on the other side of this threshold isn't obligated to soften the transition for the comfort of people who were, whether they realized it or not, benefiting from an unsustainable arrangement. Some relationships survive this transition beautifully, adjusting to the new, healthier version of the empath and often becoming stronger for it. Others don't survive it at all because they were never actually built on anything other than the empath's boundless capacity to accommodate, and once that capacity gets appropriately limited, there's simply nothing else holding the relationship together. This is, I think, the most important thing to understand about the breaking point as a whole. It's not a malfunction. It's not a sign that something went wrong in the empath's character, or that they've become bitter or difficult or somehow less loving than they used to be. It's the arrival, finally, of a limit that should have existed all along, doing exactly what healthy limits are supposed to do, protecting something valuable from being drained past the point of sustainability, and in doing so, making room for a version of connection that's actually built to last, rather than one that was always, quietly, running toward an inevitable collapse. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through today better than any explanation could. Picture a dam holding back an enormous reservoir of water built decades ago to manage a river that used to flood unpredictably, destructively every single season. For years, that dam holds steady, doing exactly what it was built to do, regulating the flow, releasing exactly what's needed downstream, containing the rest, absorbing the pressure of the water pushing against it day after day, without complaint, without visible strain, because that's simply what a dam is supposed to do. But every dam has an engineered limit, a specific amount of pressure it was actually built to withstand. And if the water behind it keeps rising year after year, without anyone ever accounting for how much additional weight is quietly accumulating against the structure, there comes a point where the dam either has to release some of that pressure deliberately in a controlled way, or risk a catastrophic failure that destroys everything downstream all at once. The breaking point for an empath is the moment the dam finally, deliberately, begins releasing pressure it was never actually designed to hold indefinitely, on its own, without any relief. And here's what's crucial to understand about this release. It isn't the dam failing. It's the dam finally doing the only thing that could actually prevent it from failing completely, adjusting its output, protecting its own structural integrity, refusing to hold back an infinite, ever-increasing amount of pressure just because it always had before it. And here's what happens afterward, in the months and years following that release, that almost nobody expects if they only understand the initial moment of pressure being let go. The dam doesn't stay in permanent crisis mode. It recalibrates. It finds a new, sustainable equilibrium, releasing what needs to be released, holding what can genuinely be held, protecting itself from the specific kind of catastrophic collapse that comes from an engineered structure being asked indefinitely to absorb more than it was ever built to bear alone. And the land downstream, the relationships and connections that survive this recalibration, don't actually suffer for it. If anything, they finally receive water at a rate that's sustainable, predictable, honest about what the dam can actually provide, rather than an unpredictable system that was always one particularly heavy season away from bursting entirely and destroying everything in its path all at once. That's what an empath's breaking point actually is. Not a collapse, not a failure, not evidence that something in them broke beyond repair. A structure, finally, protecting itself the way it always should have been allowed to, so that what remains standing afterward isn't a smaller, lesser version of what came before, but something far more sustainable, far more honest, and far more capable of actually lasting for everyone lucky enough to still be standing on the right side of it once the water finally, safely settles.